Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roy Knaphausen, and I'm with the National Bureau of Asian Research. It's been our great privilege to participate today with our colleagues from USJI, and so it's my special privilege to introduce President Uchida, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Roy. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to NBR USJI cohort seminars on growth or innovation in the India-Japan economic relationship. I'm Katsuichi Uchida, President of USJI. USJI stands for US-Japan Research Institute, and also I'm the Vice President of Waseda University in charge of international affairs. And first, let me explain the USJI. USJI is a non-profit research organization registered in Washington, D.C. USJI was established in April 2009 and organized by 8 leading Japanese universities. And we are financially supported by ourselves and also the Business Society of Japan and the United States as well. The mission of USJI is to promote policy-related research at our member university, to organize research fee, discuss the research result, to provide the communities by the medium of English, and also to nurture young researchers related to US-Japan relations, and to formulate a community of researchers and policymakers. Recently, USJI has collaborated with NBR, the National Bureau of Asian Research. Last February in Tokyo, we had a joint seminars on adapting to a new energy era, and last September in Washington, D.C., on the topics of opportunities and challenge in the US-Japan alliance. We are very pleased to collaborate with NBR. Today's seminar will be the third collaboration with NBR. The topic of this afternoon is, as I mentioned, growing India-Japan ties, opportunity for economic growth and strengthened cooperations. We are very pleased that His Excellency Minister Arvind Singh of the Embassy of India in Japan kindly agreed to give us keynote speech. We are very much looking forward to hearing from the minister. After his speech, there will be a panel on India's environment for innovation. 2 experts from both India and Japan will talk on these very important issues from their own perspectives. I'm quite sure today's seminars will be very stimulating and will produce fruitful and productive results. Finally, also, I would like to thank our staff members at Waseda University for their preparation for this event. And so I'd like to introduce Minister Arvind Singh. He's a specialist on the, he's seconded from the Ministry of Finance from India to Embassy of India in Tokyo, and he's in charge of business and economic activities of the India Ministry of Embassy of India in Tokyo. And so please, Minister Arvind Singh.
President Uchida, my panelists who will join me, will be here on stage after the speech. Ladies and gentlemen, while I was talking to the panelists, I realized that some of them have been working for so long in India that maybe what I'm saying would be, not much news to them. But briefly in my address, what I've tried to cover is, of course, give you a background of all of us who were observing India think that India was not doing too well in the last 2 years in the economy. So some background of that, the recent economic performance, what were the reasons and how these economic concerns are being addressed by the present government. And also, of course, the highlights of the recently concluded summit meeting that we had in Tokyo between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe in the beginning of September, 1st and 2nd September. And what does this hold for the India-Japan economic and commercial relationships in the future? So, to begin with, we saw a decisive mandate in the elections in India in May, the formation of a new government in Delhi, and early announcements by its leadership which led to a rise in expectations of performance and about India's future, both within India and across the world. We have seen a spate of visits to India by world leaders. The stock market is booming. There is a rise in new business investment announcements and an increase in the flow of funds from overseas institutions, which are proof of this rise in expectations. The union budget has been presented recently, and this was the new government's major policy statement. However, the last 2 years were tumultuous for the Indian economy. Slowing down of growth, depreciation of the rupee, growing inflation, rising fiscal deficit, and fall in foreign exchange reserves were serious challenges. During the first decade of this century, India's growth rates had caught the world's imagination, as its real GDP grew very fast, and as fast as 8.6% and 9.3% as recently as in 2009-10 and 2010-11. However, subsequent developments led a few analysts to question and doubt the India story. Corrective actions and strong fundamentals have put the economy back on course, and several macroeconomic indicators in India are now showing signs of improvement. India today is seen as one of the better performing emerging market economies, and it is believed that its vector of growth is headed upwards. The corner seems to have been turned in India's context, and all of us know that the International Monetary Fund recently came out with the World Economic Outlook, where it has downgraded the growth performance of major economies, including the European region, but it has upgraded. The only one of the few economies that it has upgraded the growth predictions is India, and it predicts that the Indian economy will grow at 5.6% and 6.4% in 2014 and 2015 respectively. So 5.6% this year and 6.4% next year is the expectation. So the sub 5% growth that we were seeing in the last few years, it is expected to now turn around. However, the performance of the last 2 years throw up certain concerns that need to be addressed. Number one, slowing down of investment. There has been a visible decline in public investment and in exports, which have characterized this slowdown in growth in recent years. So efforts will be needed to restart the investment cycle in India to boost the demand components of GDP and to attract foreign direct investment. Number two, there has been a lack of growth in the manufacturing sector. The contribution of this sector to India's GDP has remained stagnant at about 25%. Our national policy says that if you have to move to a modern economy, you can't move from agriculture to services. You have to have a strong manufacturing sector, and the contribution of this sector should be at least 25% of the GDP in the coming decade. But this, throws up a lot of issues, and investors in this sector have a lot of issues regarding land acquisition, inadequate physical infrastructure in some states, and labor market problems or rigidities in that market. So apart from the slowing down of investment and a lack of growth in manufacturing that we have seen in India, there is also the big question of fiscal consolidation. Fiscal deficits have been going up in India, and those from the US know what a touchy issue it is. While inflation is now softened in India, and the current account deficit seems to have been brought under control, it remains to be seen if the import compression that has aided the process is sustainable, because the import compression has mainly been on the account of compression of imports of unnecessary items like gold. Now, once the growth rate improves, imports, especially of natural gas, coal and petroleum products, are expected to rise because India's energy is highly important. Energy requirements are important. Moreover, 90% of our government subsidies go to reduce the cost of food, fertilizers and fuel for end consumers. And all of us know that subsidy reform is a policy imperative that is very difficult to implement in any economy. However, there is good news. In the recently concluded quarter, the first quarter after this government has come into power, the Indian economy has grown at 5.7%, which is the highest after nearly 2.5 years. So the 5.5 mark has been crossed. And some of the policy initiatives that have been announced by this new government in the 100+ days that it has been in power seek to address these three concerns that I have mentioned. And these are, they have retained the fiscal deficit targets at 4.1% of GDP for this year, 3.6% for next year, and 3% for the year after that, implying that there is now a roadmap which the government has laid down before the country for fiscal consolidation. The government has said that it will resort to retrospective legislation with extreme caution. This was an area of concern for major foreign investors. A stable and predictable tax regime and steps to sort out huge pending tax demand that is under dispute and litigation. Early introduction of the goods and services tax, which is a major area of indirect tax reform. Setting up of Expenditure Management Commission to look into expenditure reforms and to address the issue of subsidies. And recently it has announced the deregulation of diesel prices and increase the prices of gas in India, which definitely will help address the subsidy question. Foreign foreign direct investment rules have been liberalized. Up to 49% is now permitted in insurance, and manufacturing units have been permitted to sell products through retail and e-commerce platforms. The foreign direct investment has also been liberalized for the defense and railway sector. Now, these are areas where Japanese companies who are strong, especially in defense and railway, have, this is good news for them. And all of us know there is good news on the e-commerce area also. One of the leading companies of Japan has now gone and decided to invest in the e-commerce sector in India. The announcement was made recently. The government has also launched initiatives to incentivize investment in infrastructure, such as high-speed railways, smart cities, and urban transport systems, where again Japanese companies have strengths. And it has last month or a month before that launched the Make in India campaign to improve the investment environment in India and to direct its flow into productive sectors. Now, if you go to the website, www.makeinindia.com, you'll see a list of all the sectors and their background and all the data related to that sector. You'll find there are many areas where Japanese companies have strengths like auto components, electronics, defense, high-speed railway, pharmaceuticals, life sciences, medical equipment, where these are all areas that India is looking to attract investment in. Now I'll focus on the India-Japan story. If you look at the growing exchanges between India and Japan, never have our political and economic ties been at such a historic high. The global and strategic partnership between our two Asian democracies has great potential for expansion. And it is extraordinary, to say the least, to have 2 prime ministerial visits and 1 state visit by His Majesty the Emperor in less than a year between our two countries. Our new Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, is strongly committed to this relationship, having visited Japan twice as Chief Minister of Gujarat and worked with Japanese officials and investors while pitching for investment in that state. His maiden visit to Japan as Prime Minister has been a success and described as a path-breaking one. So looking ahead, anyone will expect stronger and political engagement between our two countries, because there are complementarities that exist between our two economies. Japan has an abundance of capital and cutting-edge technology, but it faces a dwindling market and population. The Indian economy is characterized by a booming market, fueled by the growth of an aspirational middle class. But it faces an infrastructure deficit and needs access to technology, especially in the manufacturing sector. India and Japan economic relations have tremendous potential for growth and expansion. We signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement in February 2011, and following that, we have seen growth in the volumes of bilateral trade between India and Japan. At $16.31 billion in 2013-14, it does not compare much with Japan-China or even India-China trade figures. But we expect that there will be tariff cuts and some efforts from both sides, and we could see some increase in volumes in the future. Japanese companies have invested $15.36 billion in India between 2000 to 2013, making Japan the 4th largest investor in India. Japanese overseas development assistance has supported India's economic development in priority areas such as power, transportation, environment, and in social sectors such as health and education. Today, the cumulative commitment of Japanese ODA loans to India has reached 4,150 billion yen. Flagship projects such as the dedicated freight corridor, the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor, and the proposed Chennai-Bangalore industrial corridor are high-impact infrastructure projects that are being implemented in India with Japanese assistance. Now coming to the market, Japanese cars dominate the Indian market, and automakers from Japan are expanding their production bases in India, targeting not only the domestic market, but making India as the hub for exports to West Asia and Africa on one hand, and South and Southeast Asia on the other. Similarly, heavy electrical machinery manufacturers and trading houses are also eyeing the growth in India's power equipment market. Profitable sectors that could attract Japanese investment include smart cities, rejuvenation of rivers, high-speed railway, renewable energy, electronic hardware, and life sciences. The mega infrastructure projects of the Western Dedicated Freight Corridor, which draws on a step loan, wherein the bidding process is restricted to Japanese companies by an arrangement between the Indian and Japanese governments. So, if you invest in these projects, the bidding shall be restricted to only Japanese companies. This and projects such as the DMIC and the Chennai-Bangalore Industrial Corridor offer unprecedented opportunities for Japanese industry and products to enter India. Now, against this backdrop of India's economic process, performance and the potential and scope for India-Japan economic relations, we had a great summit meeting here in Tokyo recently. And the Tokyo Declaration, which was signed after the summit, covers a broad range of subjects. Political issues, defense, security. This is a copy of the document that I have. Any one of you can go to the website of mea.gov.in, which is our foreign ministry's website, just like you have MOFA here, and you'll get details of the fact sheet. But instead of all these, including regional cooperation and civil nuclear energy, I will confine myself to the economic outcomes. And the highlights of the economic outcomes are an India-Japan investment promotion partnership was announced, which has kept a target of doubling Japanese FDI and the number of Japanese companies in India in the next 5 years as a joint objective. There is a commitment of 3.5 trillion yen of public and private financing from Japan, including overseas development assistance, to be directed into India to finance projects in next generation infrastructure. Public-private initiatives to set up electronic industrial parks in India were welcomed, and also Japanese industrial townships with national treatment, that if there is Japanese investment in an industrial township, it would get the same treatment and facilities that are available to a domestic investor, domestic company in India. Special emphasis on Japan's assistance for enhanced connectivity and development in Northeast India and linking the region to other economic corridors in India and to Southeast Asia. Japan's willingness to support the initiative of smart cities and renewable heritage cities. All of us know that a document was signed to promote partnership city arrangements between the cities of Varanasi and Kyoto. And of course, the favorite subject, Japan's readiness to provide financial, technical, and operational support to introduce the Shinkansen system, which has been appreciated by the Indian side. And there is a study going on, and the first route will probably be the Delhi-Ahmedabad route. In the assurance of support for the Ahmedabad Metro project, which is an urban transport project in the city of Ahmedabad, to strengthen energy cooperation through the India-Japan Energy Dialogue, and an agreement on manufacturing and supply of rare earth chlorides from India to Japan, Japan was now having problems in sourcing it, and India has come forward and signed an agreement. Several agreements were also signed during the summit, which for cooperation in roads and highways, an MOU between JBIC, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, and the Ministry of Renewable Energy in the field of renewable energy, and a loan agreement for a supercritical coal-fired project to promote clean coal technologies in India. So against this backdrop, I feel today's discussion on the environment for innovation, because my speakers after me are going to speak about innovation, is very timely and relevant. Intellectual property is the foundation of a knowledge-based economy, and India has taken several steps to comply with its obligations in the WTO and the agreement on TRIPS. Today we see that in India, intellectual property offices are being modernized, and we have seen a rise in the IPR applications and grants. Recently, I attended a seminar which was here, and one of India's leading IP lawyers were here, and they showed with data and statistics how the processes and timelines for grant of patents and other IPRs have been improved. And they say now the times taken to grant a patent in India is almost comparable. It used to take a lot of time because lack of capacity, lack of manpower. But now it's almost at par with international standards. While IP records have been digitized, online filings have also started, leading to improved facilities for applicants. And one very important thing is the Indian judiciary, which is seen as independent. It has generally been very pro-IP protection. And a lot of landmark judgments have gone which have favored not only domestic companies but also international companies on the issue of intellectual property, including trademarks, patents, and designs. The Indian system has no bias against foreign IP owners, and it has very effective criminal and border control remedies, making it one of the most robust IP protection systems in emerging markets. India's immature and impartial IPR regime is a positive for the investment environment, and it serves as a business differentiator for investors. The initiatives of the new administration in the last few months, such as the approval of 1,000+ new staff to clear the backlog of application, and the announcement of a new IPR policy, will further develop the existing strong net framework that we have in the country. The minister dealing with this subject in the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion has started discussions with stakeholders, and I expect that a draft IPR policy will be ready in a few months, which will put in the public domain for public debate and discussion, and before the government adopts it and Parliament takes it to take it forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, from time immemorial, whenever Indians and Japanese have worked together, they have struck a deep chord in each other. Our countries are joined by convergent interests, critical maritime interconnections, and growing international responsibilities. We share a commitment to peace, international rule of law, and an open global trade regime. So India, Japan, we have a political analyst here, but one thing that is a positive is there is bipartisan support for India-Japan relations. We draw strength from the exceptional consensus on the significance and potential of this relationship across the political spectrum. You ask any of the national political parties, and all of them are in favor of very strong India-Japan relationships, and likewise with people in all walks of life. So our economies have several complementarities that create boundless opportunities for mutually beneficial economic links and partnerships. So with these words, I thank you for giving me a patient hearing, and thank you, Waseda University and the US-Japan Research Institute for giving me this opportunity to share my views. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. We have he mentioned many three important issues. One is the current environment for the investment of India. And then also he mentioned the India-Japan bilateral relations. And finally, he mentioned about the possibilities of the Japanese investment into India, especially the innovation and IP-related matters. And we'd like to receive a few questions. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand and identify yourself and raise a question as short as possible, if that's okay.
Thank you for presentations. I'm the student from the Waseda University. I have a question. You said that India is now focused on the investment from the foreign countries and improving manufacture and also improving the energy system like electricity and so on. But I'm also concerned about the social relationship of the company. For example, if you are really trying to improve economically, you always have to be worried about environmental issues or something like that. In other words, of course, in the liberalized world, it's free for you to be improve economically, and it's free for you to choose whatever you want in the jobs. But at the same time, you also have to be worried about the right of the other people. Therefore, I want to ask you about how is the corporate governance of the India in relation with your economic development policy. Thank you.
Basically, you're talking about the conflict between development and environment, and whether there is irresponsible corporate governance. I don't think it has happened in India because we have very strong laws in India on environment protection. In fact, the complaint from investors in India is that the law is too strong. And in fact, in the last few years of the previous government, we saw very activist kind of environment, administration, where the voice of the NGOs was heard by the government a lot. And we saw, even especially since I was working in the energy sector before I came to Tokyo, I know, for instance, in the power sector that there were actually existing plants that had coal blocks allocated to them, they were deallocated, and these plants were ready and they had no coal because of environmental concerns. So I don't think against that backdrop you will find in India a compromise being made that we are going ahead with development at the expense of environment. No, I don't think so that is going to happen. There will be a balance between economic development and environment, because this is, the past has been so. But given that, what our government, the new government has done is it has streamlined the process. In the sense it has made now people who are, one of the complaints when I meet representatives from Japanese business industries here is that it takes at least 3 years to get environmental approvals in India. Whereas, your industry in Japan and everywhere is very compliant because you're very strong laws here. So, this was being raised by investors across the country. So this government has started that process where they try to make it online, remove the interface, make it much more open. So I think on this process of getting environmental clearances also we'll see improvement and the timelines will get reduced.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Koji Nozawa from TV Tokyo. You mentioned, you explained about the bilateral relations between India and Japan, and you focused on bilateral issues between Japan and India. But I'm interested in multilateral issues in Asia. I'm very interested in economic integration in Asia, and now Japan is so much interested in TPP cooperation and RCEP, Regional Cooperation for Economic Partnership. Could you explain how India sees the Asian Economic Partnership or integration? What kind of architecture are you interested in? Thank you.
Well, one thing is, you've mentioned two things. One is the integration, economic integration, and the second is the trade agreements. Now, the trade agreements, as far as India is part of the RCEP negotiations, which is ASEAN countries plus Japan, Australia, China, and other countries. So we are engaging with that, and we have certain views which are being had, which is in part of any trade agreement, that there naturally, since the level of the economy of different partners in the agreement or different stakeholders is different, our views as we in India, for instance, we feel that the services, because we are strong in services, discussions on services should go ahead first, whereas the others are interested in goods. This is an example I'm giving. But we are definitely committed to, trade agreements like the RCEP, and we will negotiate on that. And we will be part of that process. We will not derail the process. So India will be part of these trade negotiations. Secondly, on the issue of connectivity, I will just read out from the declaration, which was mentioned in the summit. So that will clarify the air, and that India is also committed to integration by way of improving connectivity. Because if you connect India from Southeast Asia to Southeast Asia, you will be connecting the rest of the other part of Asia to India. So I'll just read. Both sides welcomed the study by JICA on regional connectivity between Northeast India and the neighboring countries, and instructed respective related authorities to proceed to realizing Japan's ODA in transport infrastructure projects in the region. Both sides also welcomed the signing of a MOU between Exim Bank of India and JBIC for enhancing infrastructure development collaboration between India and neighboring countries and promoting cross-border business activities. Both sides decided to strengthen cooperation in the field of connectivity and socio-economic development in Northeast India. The Japanese side announced a survey by JICA to identify possible cooperation, including road connectivity in Northeast states of India. The Indian side appreciated assistance by Japan to Northeastern India, including a number of projects in the field of forest resource management, as well as those currently under feasibility studies by JICA, such as the potential yet known project for water supply improvement in Imphal, Manipur. So you will see a lot of emphasis on improving the road and other related infrastructure in Northeast India, which will help both India as well as Japan and other economies by promoting links between Northeast and Myanmar and other countries.
Thank you. Can I take one more question?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Oka. I have a question about overseas Indians. My name is Oka. I have a question about overseas Indians. I know overseas Chinese plays a big role in the economic development of China. And I do know there are quite a number of Indians quite prosperous in Africa, in other Asian countries. Do they play a big role in your development?
Yes, yes. So in the states which have seen a lot of migration to outside the countries are predominantly the states of Punjab, Gujarat, and Kerala. These three states, for instance, people from Kerala have migrated predominantly to the Middle East, and it's a total money order economy. They live there, they work there, but they're sending money back to their families.
Right.
And their families are living here and they're investing in all their assets and everything. So their assets are all being built in. If I have to give the example of Kerala and Punjab, because they're using migrant labor. As far as professionals who migrate to Europe or US and all that who are working, you will find them coming back when they, to work in companies which can give them employment, either multinational or Indian companies. And you find many examples of very successful professionals in medicine or in the field of finance or other areas coming back to work in India, if they feel they have a comparable level of work environment. And you find a lot of overseas resident Indians who are entrepreneurs investing in successful enterprises in India because they want to have a stake. So definitely they are contributing. Probably the Chinese, overseas residents are large in number, have larger resources, the impact is more. But I think this is a trend that we are seeing in India and it will grow in the future.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question.
My name is Naoko Kato, from Senagaku University of Fukuoka. I have one question. I think it is very good idea to encourage the manufacturing industry, and because manufacturing industry absorbs a lot of labor. And however, if we look at the countries which encourage manufacturers, like China and Brazil and even Bangladesh, we can see the growth of female labor participation. But so in India, it's a very opposite phenomenon is occurring. Withdrawal female labor is very outstanding in India. So in expense of female labor withdrawal, so India try to maintain male labor participation. It's I'm worrying about gender empowerment by labor participation of female.
No, I don't think there is any, there must be some economic or social reason for which if the figures what you're saying is there is happening. But there is definitely an encouragement to more and more participation by women in all strata in society. I mean, if you see political empowerment, we've had Indian prime ministers who are women, presidents who have been women, speakers, two speakers of the parliament. As I speak, there are chief ministers of some very important states who are women. So political empowerment is definitely there. If you find, their participation in management, let me tell you that today India's largest bank in the public sector is headed by a lady. India's largest bank in the private sector is headed by a woman. And we have 3 other CEOs of leading banks. So top 5 banks in India are currently headed by women. So even in, we are seeing no barriers to the growth of women in politics, no barriers to the growth of women in professional occupation, especially educated women. If there are some barriers in labor force, but these may be local, economic or social, I don't think there is any resistance from either the government or any of the agencies to stop female labor force participation. But if there are chances, we will definitely see growth.
Thank you very for interesting and stimulating discussions among the here speakers and audience. But I'm afraid we are running out of the time. So we would like to applaud Mr. Srinivasan. Thank you very much.
Now, if we could have our panelists join, we'll begin the second part of our program. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Roy Camphausen. I'm with the National Bureau of Asian Research, which is an American think tank committed to finding policy solutions to solve critical challenges in Asian relations, and in particular with the United States interaction with various states in Asia. We are here today and this morning had a very fruitful workshop looking at collaborative solutions for Indian-Japanese interaction in the fields of innovation and IP. We had a tremendous presentation by Dr. Amit Kapoor, who is President and CEO of the Indian Council on Competitiveness and a scholar and professor in his own right. And he will offer some thoughts in summary of his presentation this morning. But first, we'll invite Professor Takako Hirose to give a presentation. She was sharing that she became a scholar of India and South Asia as part of her pursuing her PhD, and has really never left the field, and so has had a long and remarkable career. She's currently professor of South Asian politics and international politics at Senshu University here in Tokyo. After each of the panelists have presented, I will offer just a few thoughts to stimulate our discussion, sort of the summary recommendations that came out of this morning's session, and then we'll invite a time of question and comment from the audience for the rest of the time of our panel. With that, Professor Hirose, if you would begin.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. I'm Takako Hirose. I am a professor of Senshu University, and I have been working on India and South Asian politics for the last 3 decades or more. So, since I'm a political scientist, I am also the minister. Mr. Minister explained the Japan-India relationship in details. So I'm going to give a kind of overall background relationship between India and Japan. So Japan has now renewed and much greater expectations of Mr. Modi's India, mainly in 2 fields. One is economy, obviously, and the second one is defense and strategic cooperation. And perhaps the 2 are combined into a kind of science and technology cooperation. And since Mr. Modi's visit to Japan, Prime Minister Modi's visit to India in the year 2000, Japan and India have developed a kind of strategic cooperation, strategic and defense cooperation, including that of Coast Guard. So after the nuclear test of India in 1998, the relationship between Japan and India deteriorated, and it was very bad. But even during that time, the kind of military cooperation continued. And especially the Coast Guard, which is free from constitutional limitations of Japan, had a very good relationship with India. But one of the most important factors of this kind of development is obviously, from the Japanese side, it's China factor. And although Japanese government wants to develop and strengthen relationship with India because of China, India doesn't agree on this point. So there is a gap between in perception between the two countries. And also it reflects the long tradition of foreign policy. Japanese foreign policy is basically a US-Japan alliance foreign policy, whereas India's foreign policy has been known to be non-alignment. Although non-alignment itself might have gone, still India's sort of mentality is still there. So India doesn't want to surrender its sovereignty to anyone, including the United States. So that is one obstacle. Japan has to recognize how India feels about and what are the priorities of India's foreign policy are. So, but I think in the 1990s, when Mr. Abe's first administration took office, Japan's foreign policy was to sort of encircle China with India, but it wasn't welcomed by Indians. So I think they have the Japanese politicians have learned a lesson, and now they know, they appreciate India as it is, and they understand India's position. That is the strategic relationship. And the second obstacle is perhaps the Japanese constitutional limitation, which limits the cooperation in military field. But now with Abe administration's policy to liberalize the defense equipment export, I think there is a much better scope for that. And the third factor is Japan, India, US triangle dialogue, which obviously Japan wants to promote. But India has been, is much more active now, positive now, but still there is some difference in attitudes and between Japan and India. And that is and then the scope and prospect that I see in India-Japan relationship is defense production and also R&D, research and development. Japan has now opened up to some extent on defense production and also research and research and development. And India is obviously one of the countries that Japan could cooperate. And India and Japan, both countries have very advanced technologies, and they respect each other in this field. For example, nuclear field. Well, the nuclear agreement hasn't been agreed yet, but I think it's only a matter of time. And the nuclear technology, India wants Japanese civil nuclear technologies and to get the best technologies from everywhere in the world, and India wants to sort of have its own standards, taking all the good advanced technologies from everywhere, and for that Japan is a must. So that is one thing. But at the same time, fast breeder reactor, for example, technology, former Atomic Energy Commission, chairman of the Atomic Energy Commissioner, said that India probably has more advanced technology in terms of fast breeder reactor. So, both countries have advanced technologies and they can cooperate. This is one, not only in nuclear field, but also science and technology in general. And this is the most rosy field that I see. And then I'll move on to economic relationship. I have been going to India for the last 30, 40 years. And I used to hear a lot of complaints about Japanese businessmen complaining about India, lack of infrastructure, and also the bureaucracy and the no availability of Japanese food, for example. And that is a big thing for Japanese businessmen to have business in India. So a lot of complaints, but now I think all these complaints have receded. And I visited Toshiba in the summer this year, and they have they are setting up a factory there to manufacture turbines for power plants. And the conditions are not that good, but they are really enthusiastic. And they have a factory in Chennai, near Chennai, and Tamil Nadu is not the best state to invest. For example, I've been to Gujarat as well. Gujarat is much more friendly, investor-friendly state. But Tamil Nadu, they said their factory is the second after Japan. So they have all the energy and enthusiasm there. So now I think Japanese business people have changed their attitude to a great extent, so that even the bad infrastructure or other conditions, they can put up with that. So I see a lot of future in Japanese investment there, and especially good is the medium and the small scale industries. Now, and then the Japanese people still do worry about some conditions in India. One is labor relationship, and the second is infrastructure, of course, and the third is probably bureaucracy. And these are the sort of worries that they have. But in some states, now that India is liberalizing, the states have more power than the nation, the center itself. And some states, there is a competition among states, and that competition will certainly help improve the conditions. And for that, I think the Japanese business people are now carefully choosing which state to go into. And with this, there is a lot of scope and there is a lot of future for Japanese investment. And then lastly, I have to mention nuclear agreement and also US-2 seaplanes. One is a nuclear agreement. I have a question actually. Japanese people think that we have a special status in terms of nuclear field. So the Japanese side would like to have something in addition to the India-US agreement, 123 agreement. Whereas the Indian side, I think the 123 agreement, India-US agreement is the maximum that they can give. So there's some sort of difference at the moment, but it will probably soon solve the problem. And one question I have is that the liability law of India, which sort of discourages foreign countries to go into India in terms of nuclear. And India made all sorts of efforts to have this US-India agreement and also approval of the LSG. But soon after that, India passed this liability law, according to which not only operators, but also the suppliers will have some liability. And that makes us wonder if really India wants to have nuclear power plants in India. That is one thing. I think I will finish here now.
Thanks.
Thank you, Roy. In fact, I'll keep my comments to innovation environment in India. If you really look at the whole idea of India, and if you really try to understand the perspective of competitiveness, and I'll try to give this whole analysis from the perspective of competitiveness. What is competitiveness? Very clearly, competitiveness is about productivity. And when we say productivity, it is about the way we actually use our resources, and that effectively means that how do I actually use my land, how do I actually use my labor, and how do I actually use my capital. So now if you really try to go deeper into this analysis, we have to say when you talk about using land, labor, capital, the question is going to be what kind of products am I actually making within the system? And what is the value that I actually bring on the table? What's the additional things that I'm able to do? And then quite likely the question is going to be, are people willing to pay for it? So am I actually at the high end of the value chain or the food chain for the products, or I'm actually at the lower end of the food chain for the products? And last but not the least, the most important point from a perspective of competitiveness is that it is about how firms compete in a region. It's not about countries, it's about what firms do within a region. A lot of points in time we actually tend to believe that it is just about policy, that everything's going to actually happen. It is also about firm behavior, which also defines as to what is really going to happen. Let me give you a few cases in point here. In fact, you'll be surprised to know that the most unsafe car in the country, which is, and this is a result that came in yesterday, is actually made by a Japanese enterprise in India. So that's a very, very interesting information, because a lot of people will tend to believe that Japanese products are great or Indian products are bad, or there is a lot of innovation that can actually happen. So Suzuki actually, Maruti Suzuki, they actually make a car called Swift, which has actually been given a rating of 0 on safety index. That means it is a car which is not supposed to run on the roads. Quite interesting. So what I'm saying is that there are going to be firms who actually look at information, who actually look at the environment, and they tend to be exploitative. And it's not only true for Indian enterprises, it's true for the multinational enterprises as well. Moving ahead, there are going to be firms who actually do something exceptional with the kind of availability of things. And there is a case of Nippon Steel, which is a very positive example. That they actually would import iron ore from India and probably make the finest steel in the world, and they export it back to India, and at a lower cost than the prime steel that is made in India. So there are efficiencies in the system also. What I'm trying to say is that how firms compete is actually what is going to define what is competitiveness of a nation, and how they actually look at the whole level playing field. But then to say that, to really push the point and push the agenda, if you really talk about countries, it is about inherited prosperity versus created prosperity. And when you talk about inherited prosperity, it is about what do I do with my land, labor, capital? Am I at the lower end of the food chain? I'm just really going to exploit my resources. So it is something like an IT industry in India. So it is about labor arbitrage. And you're not really moving onto the higher end of the chain. You're not really doing a lot of innovation. And that is where our thinking, or a limited level of thinking, actually comes in. Because I did ask this question in the morning, and I should actually pose that question again. Whether it is high-tech industries or low-tech industries, or high-tech firms or low-tech firms, it is always about high-tech firms and low-tech firms. There is no industry which is high-tech or low-tech. I think that is the biggest misnomer in the world. That's the very limited thinking. Because the moment we say there's a high-tech industry, you're trying to say that there is no innovation that can actually happen in agriculture. So there are firms which can actually do exceedingly well within agricultural space itself. And this is where I actually would like to bring back the point of innovation. And innovation will also mean that it has to be about branding. How do I actually build something? A very simple case in point, a product like iPhone. Everybody across the world is seemingly a big fan of iPhone, but look at the kind of markups that the company actually exhibits on that. The product, which is the cost of manufacturing of the product on an iPhone 6 Plus, is less than $200 and sells for over $600. That means there is margin in terms of creating brands as well. A typical pair of shoe, which is made in India for about 5,000 rupees, could be sold in Italy for about $10,000. So that is a markup which is absolutely remarkable. So saying that innovation is just about high tech, it is just about technology. No, it has to be really about how you actually create value around it. How do you actually create business models with what you're actually offering? Quite interestingly, if you really look at the solutions for India, the solutions for India have to be the business model solutions. In fact, a lot of times you would actually come in and say that we are just going to implement the solution that we have here. No, it's not really going to work. The solutions for India will have to be dramatically different from the West. And of course, like what you learn from India could actually get implemented in the West, but what you learn from the West is not necessarily going to get implemented in India. For a simple reason that the environment is different, the scale is different, the reality is different. Say if you really talk about how Moser Bear as an enterprise actually fought the whole idea of intellectual property and theft of music or theft of movies. They actually changed the business model by redefining the price point for the movies. They actually brought down the prices for a movie DVD to $1. And suddenly the whole rental business, the whole movie piracy business actually started dwindling. So that means there are possibilities of really working on. So there are going to be different pricing models that would actually work. But then of course, like moving ahead, if you really look at the next proposition, it is about innovative capacity, which is going to lead to competitiveness and which is going to lead to prosperity. But the question that thus arises is that whether India has the adequate innovation capacity. And a lot of times we tend to believe there is a huge positive fillip that everybody gives. We have the IITs, we have the IIMs, we have X number of professors, we have X number of institutions and things. And I think that's marketing. Because from my point of view, any institution in the country is not really doing any kind of favors to India in terms of doing research and everything. I always say that Indian academics are the biggest non-performing assets of the world. A lot of people would hate me here, there's an Indian sitting on the back. But then the question is, I've been an academic myself, and it's absolutely a shame. If you really talk about IITs, why are IITs great? IITs are great because great students get in and great students get out. Not because there are great faculty members there, or there is some great research that has actually happened. How many patents actually happen out of IITs? And in fact, quite interestingly, we did look at the data. We found that MIT alone actually did more patents than India in the period of 1997 until 2004 than the whole country put together. So that was an amazing figure. We were shocked. India did about 363 patents with the USPTO in that time frame. And if you really look at the IITs, they did 0. So that's a very interesting statistic for you. That means we have to really fundamentally rethink about the institutions, how they really work. And I think there is a limited view of international universities thinking that only everything actually happens within the governmental universities or the IITs or IIMs. There are far better places. There are places which actually make a bigger contribution. But I think they're all brands. They've been brands which have been carefully crafted, and that's where it is. But then moving into the next realm, I think the whole idea of innovation, we have to understand one thing, that it is just not about India per se. It has to be looked at from a different level of geography. India will have to be understood from the perspective that India is about 28, 29 different realities. When I say 28, 29 different realities, it's about the number of states that are there. This number could dramatically change any moment because there's a new government or there's a new person who will say, okay, let's break another state into 2 or 3. But the question is, let's try to understand each one of them has a different reality or a different context. If you talk about the growth rates that have actually happened, there are 8 states which grew at a rate which is greater than the rate of growth of India. So that means that the whole onus of growth has actually happened in those 8 states. And there's a very interesting set of numbers that I should share. 16% to 17% of India's GDP actually comes from one single state, and that is Maharashtra. And 32% of patents actually happen from that single state. So that's interesting statistic for us to actually look at. And then of course, when you talk about exports, 2 states actually contribute to 45% of India's exports, that is Gujarat and Maharashtra. So there is a lot of industry which is actually going to a certain sort of location and things. But remember, it's just not about states. You have to go deeper into the states as well. You have to look at a smaller level of geography and understand cities. When you talk about Maharashtra, 17% of GDP that India actually gets from Maharashtra, 90% of it is actually coming from 6 different locations. Surprisingly so, so that means Bombay, Pune, Aurangabad, and so on and so forth, they actually contribute a huge number. And they are the hubs of innovation, if at all you might actually say. There is certain level of innovation, there is certain level of capacity, or entrepreneurial capacity that is actually getting built into these cities. But we cannot actually look at these cities from one single perspective, that every city is going to be great for X kind of technology or Y kind of technology. In India, we seem to have an obsession that every city is going to be an IT hub, but I think that's actually abysmally wrong. It's absolutely horribly wrong. There are cities which have invested money in droves, but they've not really ended up becoming anything because they do not really understand the local conditions. So you have to understand that local reality as well. So there could be a resilient ecosystem or an entrepreneurial ecosystem that exists in a city of Bangalore, that probably exists in the city of Hyderabad, but it does not really exist in the city of Chandigarh. So you have to really understand the cities, you have to go to smaller levels of geography. To paint that India is non-innovative would actually be wrong on my part. I do actually say it all the time, that India actually lacks innovation capacity, but there are some points of geographical locations where innovation does happen. There is a little bit of what I would always call as talent, technology, tolerance, influx, where everything works together and actually creates a creative economy. But that is actually for a few cities in the country. And then if you really look at these, again, looking at a certain set of industries, you will find that innovation actually happens in certain set of industries and certain set of locations. Say for automotive, there are 5 locations where everything will happen. It is actually going to be in Gurgaon, it's going to be in Pune, Aurangabad, Chennai, and one more location, I'm forgetting. So that is where things are going to happen. And when you talk about IT, it is actually going to be about a place like Hyderabad, again Pune, or even Gurgaon for an extent, or Noida, and so on and so forth. So it's about a certain set of locations where things are going to happen. But remember, the most critical factor that actually comes in is about innovation that actually happens. Whether innovation is happening in real terms. India seemingly is not really innovating as an aggregate. It seemingly is lacking behind, but I think we always sit behind thinking that jugaad or the shortcut is the innovation. We have started giving a very Indianized definition to innovation. It's not true. We have not really started building models or unique business models with the kind of things that we are actually doing. So the Skype was not created in India. It was created in Estonia with a very few limited number of engineers. So when you have 1 million engineers who actually pass out of the country every year, what's the level of innovation that we actually look at? So that's where we have to start looking at numbers. We need to actually get into a perspective. There are possibilities, but the ecosystems do not exist. The support mechanisms do not exist. Whether the government is actually uniquely supporting. I think there has to be a certain criticism of the government, but I think that's for the previous set of regimes that there were a lot of bottlenecks that actually did happen. And hopingly, right now we are actually hoping that things will change. I do not know how much change will actually happen. But if that change happens, then it is going to be for good. Like this is for the first time in India that a certain government in its budget has said that we are going to spend 7,000 crores, about $1 billion in about 5 to 6 months on entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship activity. That is important. Was it actually part of the paradigm? No. So what the question here is, I'm actually looking at a very deeper sense of a deeper issue, that it is about whether we are wanting to be a job-seeking nation or a job-creating nation. So you have to be a job-creating nation. In fact, what the minister said was exactly that. We need to have manufacturing. And why manufacturing? Because it is actually going to create jobs. So India is actually going to look at industries where jobs would actually happen, or services where jobs would actually happen. And quite interestingly, a lot of times we have to understand that local economies are run. 85% of a local economy is always run by local traded industries. It's not run by a big house that you would actually think of. In Tokyo, there are so many restaurants. There's so much that actually happens within the system, which actually runs this system. It's not about the big enterprise. Big enterprises actually do an impact, but then most of the system stays because of the small and medium enterprises. How do I actually create innovation there? How do I actually push that innovation there? How do I actually create respect for innovation and making people understand that innovation is something with which you can actually create wealth? So the whole paradigm that wealth creation can actually happen with innovation is exceedingly important for us to understand and appreciate. We have somehow not been able to appreciate that. That when you actually innovate, when you have a patent, when you actually have an intellectual property with you, it can give you a competitive advantage, it can create wealth for you, you can start controlling a certain set of industries, and so on and so forth. So that needs to be actually done, and we have to really look at it in the future. So this is where it is. So my primary lesson is that you have to understand resources, you have to use your resources well, you have to actually create value on the resources, and you have to actually go or move towards created prosperity, not get stuck in the paradigm of created prosperity. And you have to actually say that innovative capacity will make you more competitive, will make you more prosperous. Thank you.
If I may add one thing, we always have to think to remember that India is a democracy, and innovation also has its own limit because of democracy. Well, I have been working on the power sector of power reforms of India. And the Indian tariff differs on agriculture and household and industry. There are different prices on electricity, and of course government has to pay a lot of subsidies, and there's a lot of talk about reforms. But in the Indian definition of energy security is to provide energy to all the people, irrespective of their ability to pay or not. So even if those who cannot pay, cannot really afford to pay the electricity bill, have a right to access to the energy. And it's the government's responsibility to provide all these people with sufficient power. Of course, not everybody has got access to power, but this is uniquely India, and I haven't seen any such definition elsewhere. But this is India, and if India wants to say reform electricity power system, then they have to take that into consideration.
I'm compelled to make a point here because I somehow vehemently disagree with what you're saying for a simple reason. If you really talk about it, the way you're saying that India is a democracy and that is a lag on the system, but we have to understand that there are democracies which have done exceedingly well. The most respected democracy in the world, from my point of view, is the United States, and one of the most innovative countries in the world. It has actually been at the forefront of creating unique solutions, models, and technology as well, without a doubt. Germany is a democracy. It actually does exceedingly well on what I call high-end engineering. Switzerland is a democracy that does exceedingly well on precision engineering. So democracies have a role. I think it's about the ecosystem that we are able to keep in place. It's about the cultural aspects of respect for paying for products. I think India is actually lacking that respect for paying for products. So what happens is when you say that the government has to provide electricity, it is not a matter of rights and that somebody needs to be given electricity. It's a service, and I think people need to learn to pay for the service. The question is going to be, what is the business model that I actually create on energy and how that is going to happen? There are unique village level solutions that are coming up today. I think today you can actually make villages self-sufficient on agriculture by installing unique solar systems. So you can actually have a village level grid or a village level mechanism where everybody can actually have a light and a fan and whatever, and everything works. There are rooftop solutions that are actually being made available, and thankfully India is actually under the sun belt. At least there are 6 or 7 states which are under the sun belt, and they can definitively use solar energy or alternate energy, and they can actually go into that direction. So I think it's just a question of how much do we want to pay for services. And there are successful examples wherein people understand the value and they pay for it. Bombay, for example, or Calcutta, for example, where you have private enterprises who distribute energy. So I don't think it's about democracy, it's about our attitudes. I think what lacks here is that we have forgotten our fundamental sense of duties, rather than just saying that it's a fundamental sense of, it's not something that has to be given. I severely disagree with you. I hope the minister also agrees with me on this, that it's not a matter of right that we have to give electricity to everybody if he's stealing. Yes, so that is where it is. I think it's a very resilient system, but we just need to learn from how other systems have actually operated. We can only say India is a young democracy. India is trying to find its way. India is trying to find the right governance model. I think India is still at a nascent stage where it is still struggling to find what is the right governance model.
And if I may add to that, because I was in the power sector, so I'll just come to your assistance a little. See, the basic question that you said about power tariffs is that some sections of the population in India are, get power at subsidized rates, and some sections of the population have to pay very high rates. So typically, what you see is that those in industry or commerce, because they have the paying capacity, are charged at higher rates. Today, I had a delegation from Punjab to meet me, and they're all industrialists from Ludhiana. They said they're paying on an average 8 rupees per unit of power in Ludhiana. And commercial, that is malls and hotels and multiplexes, will have to pay at about 9 rupees. So they pay higher, whereas the farmer in Punjab pays 0. He doesn't pay at all. In fact, the tariff is 50% that the government pays. That the government pays out of its own coffers. So yes, you have highlighted the point that tariff reform is the crucial issue in, to improve the health of the power sector in India. But I'll tell you certain things again which have happened. And so I'm hopeful that things will improve. Number one, the power, the Electricity Act, which was passed in 2003, and that has said that if you take the average cost of supply the maximum power tariff should be plus 20% and the minimum should be minus 20%. So that is the roadmap that every state and every wants to move to. And this has happened in a few states. Gujarat, where Mr. Modi was the Prime Minister, was the Chief Minister, there we saw a movement towards this, where Gujarat, the differential between the industrial rate and the bottommost rate is not very high. So as a result, the power companies are healthy. And in Gujarat, the lowest tariff, which is agriculture, is at about 2 rupees 50 paise per unit, which is the lowest tariff, and the highest tariff is about 6 rupees. So the differential is not much. Similarly, I found in the state of Madhya Pradesh, they raised the agriculture tariff and they were able to bring down the industrial tariff. Unfortunately, the state where I was working in the power sector in Maharashtra had one of the widest gaps. And you know, the tariff was as high for industry as about 7 rupees, and whereas agriculture was paying 1.1, 1.5. So if this is the average cost of supply and the topmost tariff is, at this level and the bottommost, the higher this is, the higher the lower point is, the higher will have to be the subsidy. So the challenge is to bring it down to that plus minus 20%. And I'm seeing trends towards that. It has happened in 1 or 2 states, so hopefully it will happen in more.
Yes, yes. But it depends on the conditions of the state.
Yes.
Gujarat doesn't have much agriculture, not a large agricultural sector, so it was possible. But Punjab is an agricultural state, so that kind of a reform is difficult.
Madhya Pradesh, it is happening. Madhya Pradesh.
Yes, so.
I think we have to go beyond the petty political issues in terms of pricing of electricity. What you're hinting at is a petty political issue that India actually suffers. Like the politician will say, let's do zero tariff for electricity, and that's what happens in Punjab at points in time. I think that's a very idiotic decision. It's not supposed to be done that way. It has to.
It is not sustainable because what it has done is zero tariff on agriculture has made the Punjab state itself bankrupt.
Yeah.
Because they are going to, you're spending a huge amount of the subsidy. So there will be a day when they'll realize the foolishness of that decision and they will have to reverse this.
Quite a lot of times I must share a story with you. That when you talk about free electricity, it actually has a huge problem or impact on water table also. And somebody will say, okay, now what is the impact or relationship between water table and electricity? What happens in Punjab? Electricity is free and it comes at night. So this farmer will, what he'll do is he'll switch on his water evacuation system or tube well, the pump in the night, and he'll come back in the evening. In the evening he'll be sitting in water, standing in water which is knee deep in his fields. He has wasted so much of water actually by the end of the day. So there are definitively other set of our life problems that actually happen. We have to understand or look at it from a complete perspective. I think the solutions are there. It's just we were digressing into a political debate. I think we have to come back to economic debate now.
Well, before we open the discussion to all of you and to hear your questions and comments, I thought it might be useful to give 3 summary points from this morning's session. We certainly talked about many things. We had, I guess, 6 presentations, but I thought it'd be helpful to share 3 points that really speak to the topic of our panel, which is India-Japan interaction in innovation policy. The first point by a presenter from a Japanese university is that there's some variation between sectors, Japanese companies that are investing in India, but still a high degree of concern with the innovation environment that they find themselves in. The comparison was between the electronics sector that is not terribly concerned about India's patent environment. And the reason is because India is seen as a platform for participation in the global system, the global patenting network, and production in India is really a platform for export. And so Japanese companies operating in India, electronics companies, are not terribly concerned with the environment. On the other hand, Japanese pharmaceutical companies, much like their American and European counterparts, are deeply concerned about the uncertainty that national policies in India engender, especially related to patentability, a whole range of issues there, as well as the use of the uncertain application of compulsory licenses. That's the first main point, and an uncertain innovation environment in India. The second point emerged from our discussion is that there are real imperatives for the Indian government to consider reform. And there are incentives to do so. The statistic was cited that the OECD has done some analysis that suggests that a 1% improvement in IP protections correlates to a 3% improvement in foreign direct investment. That a better IP environment will have a greater, actually a 3-to-1 return in terms of FDI. And as the minister discussed, and as is apparent from the new Modi administration, increasing numbers of FDI will really help contribute to growth and sustaining the rates that have been talked about and are important for job creation in India. That's the first point of imperatives and incentives. The second is that some international, multinational companies set artificially low targets for their own market share opportunities. They set a low bar for what they hope to accomplish within the Indian market. And this is a function of, as at least explained to us, due to the uncertain innovation environment. This has another application, especially in the pharmaceutical field. There was a study by scholars at MIT who said that many new drugs are slow to enter the Indian market because of this, and this results in a so-called delayed access to innovation. That there are no incentives or low incentives for pharmaceutical companies to introduce new drugs, and that's related to the IP environment. Well, those are two key points. The third was we had some very useful and I think worth noting suggestions for collaboration between India and Japan, and I'll cite three. The first is that Japan has made dramatic strides in the last decade in improving its regulatory environment, particularly as it pertains to pharmaceuticals, and that there is real opportunity for exchange and interaction between Japan regulators and their Indian counterparts as it relates to regulation of new pharmaceuticals. The second is that there's a tremendous opportunity for engagement on manufacturing policy. The minister talked about the importance of manufacturing as a driver of continued economic growth. And one of our specialists who spoke this morning suggested that there are real legislative reforms that could be undertaken, and he has actually been a part of making such recommendations that would create more incentives for industry university relationships that would contribute to new tech development, which would have important implications. And the third opportunity for engagement between Indian and Japanese counterparts is in the legal field. That Japan has set up an IP court, for instance. It's been around for about a decade. It's got the appropriate feeder courts to make it useful. India does not yet have an IP court. And the opportunity for exchange between specialists in the area of IP courts, judges, legal exchange, this is a third area for really potential significant exchange between specialists in both countries. Well, three key points that highlight some of the things we talked about this morning. We'd like now to turn to audience to hear your thoughts, questions, comments. Please do identify yourself and your affiliation when you ask your question or make your comment. Thank you.
So my question is for you. I'm from Kerala. Yeah. So it's regarding the education and the innovation. On one side, when we hear that India has done a very good job in innovating the Mars Orbiter mission, which has been one of the Mars Orbiter mission, which has been the cheapest one ever done by ISRO. And on the other side, we have the problems of brain drain. That means a lot of intelligent students are being, after you complete IITs are just going out. So don't you feel that we need to innovate more on the education system first, and with the collaboration of US and Japan? Don't you feel that we need to make some innovations in our education system?
Okay, I'll take your comment first and then I'll come to education. When you say brain drain, I don't think there is anything like brain drain. When you talk about economies which trade, right, humans are also being traded, or human minds or intellect is being traded. So there's nothing wrong in that. So people will gravitate towards places which are going to be very good, that is where education is going to happen, that is where talent is required, and they'll gravitate. And you actually see that internal movement within the country as well. They always gravitate to the better places. Say you're from Kerala and you might want to actually move to Hyderabad, or you might actually want to move to Bombay, and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of thing that happens. So I don't think there is anything wrong in labor movement. I think, and if you really talk about from a trade theory perspective, we've always understood that yes, land can be easily moved. That means resources can be easily moved from one location to the other. The capital can actually move, so there is free capital that moves and so on and so forth. But why do we actually have a negative view on human capital? There should not be a negative view. If you really look at countries across the world, countries which have become the hubs of innovation, for some reason, they always were able to attract the finest talent. So what needs to happen here is that India needs to find a way to actually attract and keep talent, rather than stopping IITs to actually go, because otherwise what will happen is brain drain to brain in the drain. That should not actually happen. And in terms of the education, I fully agree with you that we have to fundamentally alter our educational system. I think there are 2 or 3 issues with the educational system. One, that, and it starts from the schools itself. It does not really start at the higher education level. The problem with the schooling system is that we do not ask our kids to question. The kids in India are not allowed to question. I think it's a very feudalistic system, and till the time I do not tell my kids to question, till the time I don't ask my kid to break an iPhone and still be happy with it, and be happy that okay, at least he's been able to understand the circuitry, we will not be able to innovate. I think it's a question of how do we break, how do we make things, how does that whole process happen, how can we question, how can we look at assumptions. So I think we have to move from the Macaulay's way of really thinking or education to a little more different kind where people are able to actually go back and understand and let them do things. So that what I would say is probably the closest thing I could say in schools is probably Montessori or whatever, that where kids are able to do things and then they learn and that's how they go and do things. Probably the IB system. CBSE is too much rote learning, or that's the central board that actually happens in India. But in terms,
how do they learn how to ask questions then?
I
Indians do ask questions.
I don't think so. That's true actually, because when you say ask questions, you are meeting the aggressive lot like me, who are actually trying to snub or do whatever. And I think there are times when we are actually not asking questions. In fact, the feudalistic mindset is so high. I hope minister is not going to mind my saying it, but then he is a bureaucrat. He is a very influential bureaucrat in his place, and he would find that there are people who would not come and sit in front of him, who will not question him, who will not. There are going to be people of that nature, and especially so that means there has to be some kind of a big change that needs to be actually happening, and we need to go beyond that. But coming to the education thing, for the higher education, I think the impetus has to be on doing it, has to be on research. I think Indian students today are not told how to do research. I think we have actually become a society which has become too job-centric. We are not entrepreneurship-centric. In fact, I would like to give an example. I'll not name the school, but there are schools in India who have closed down their entrepreneurship cells or incubation centers. And that's the most idiotic decision from my point of view. So a country which needs entrepreneurship closes down the incubation center in a business school. What does that mean? Either you should close down as a business school. It's a business school which is run by the finance ministry, incidentally. So I don't want to name it here. It's not the IIMs, so that's okay. But the question is, why does that actually happen? How do we actually propel professors to create enterprises? The circumstances are not such that today professors can actually run their enterprises, or who can actually get the benefits of the innovations that they actually do. We should propel professors to say, create enterprises on campus. US professors today are able to create enterprises. They are able to create enterprises, they are able to actually enjoy the benefits of the hard work that they've actually done. Because at the end of the day, how do you measure it? You measure it with monetary impact. There is no other way to actually measure that impact. Or at least for myself, of course, the greater societal good will happen because businesses will solve societal problems. But professors will have to get recognized for it. We have not done that. So we have to move into that direction. So it's an attitudinal shift that needs to be done from feudalistic mindset to questioning to how we are teaching, what is happening in the universities, what kind of research is happening. In fact, I think the international community is to be blamed for it as well. Whatever or whoever professor I meet, oh, we are working with the IITs, right? Okay, I'm working with the IIMs. But if I ask them, okay, why IITs? They're great institutions. Why are great institutions? Just they are great institutions. There is no answer that is available to them because it is a system which says it is great, so it is great. So you're actually suffering from a herd mentality. It happened with me in the morning as well, so I'll tell you that, like, we were working with the IITs, yes, but why? We don't have an answer for it. Because we just want to be seen with them. We do not want to be seen with alternate places. I found a lady today in the morning who was working with some alternate institutions and thankfully not stuck with the IITs. So, and I think there is a real possibility that could actually happen there.
Thank you very much. My name is Nagabi. I hope this age starts to success. My question the question is that I forgot what my question. Just talking about the innovations, and the Japanese company have to choose the specific state because India is a big country, so it's state by state. It's every state is different. So that's the reason why we had better choose the targeted state, to invest money. And I was talking about what we are very much worrying about is India as a socialist countries and some kind of the bureaucratic process and very material process and so on. So what most Japanese, you just mentioned about Suzuki automobile companies, and they invest to India in early times, certainly, and have a lot of effort to cultivate the market. Now occupy 80% of the Indian automotive market. Tada will try to get it back. But Suzuki's quality is, I promise you, that's very good, and the safety is also good, and so it's very different from your opinion as well. But the only we are very much worrying about is that you mentioned the paradigm shift. Seems to me that it's the Modi government have to choose some of the state and the more investment oriented state and do some kind. So that is my how do you think about that?
Of course, like your first point. I'll come to the states later, but I have to talk about Suzuki. It's not my opinion, it's an opinion that was published in the newspaper yesterday, that Suzuki makes the most unsafe cars in the country. In fact, two companies, one is Datsun. Incidentally, that's also a Japanese-owned Nissan brand. Datsun Go and Suzuki, whatever the car is, Suzuki Swift. They're the most unsafe cars in the country. So it's a newspaper report which I read in the morning, so I thought I should share with you. So I'll give you the reference to the report and you can actually talk to them. Personally, I think they're good cars. I've actually used Suzuki cars for at least 10 years. I'm a little worried if that is true, but then I have one at home as well right now. But then coming to the whole idea of states, I think what you're saying is bang right. It is about states. It is states who are going to compete against each other for providing the best environment. Because when you talk about India, you are going to be talking, companies do not make a country decision any longer. They are actually going to make location decision, what location to get into a country. Because when you talk about the automobile sector, there are 5 locations in India, there are a few locations in South Africa, there are a few locations in Latin America. There will be something in Europe, and you will actually make a choice as to where do you actually want to go. So whichever state provides the best environment, you would actually go there. And I think when you say the present or the existing state central government, or the Prime Minister Modi has clearly said, states will have to provide for the best environment. They will have to compete with each other. And there is a very healthy competition. It's not about that you're killing each other. It's about what provides you the best healthy competition, healthy scenarios. And that is actually going to be dependent on some policy actions and of course some clusters that have actually happened there. And we will also have to be careful in terms of choosing as enterprises what location is good for what kind of an industry. Every state is not good for every industry. Maharashtra is good for, say, something in terms of, say, automobile or automotive manufacturing. Within Maharashtra, Bombay is great for finance, Pune is great for IT, or Chinchwad and Aurangabad are great for automotive and spare parts and everything. So that's there. So you have to really understand the location and then make an investment. We have to go deeper into the locational assessments and then actually make a choice. If you want to actually start a steel plant, a lot of companies will say, oh, let's go to Gujarat. No, you will never open a steel plant in Gujarat. Because for a simple reason that Gujarat does not have either the iron ore or the capacity for the kind of water that you actually need for creating steel. So you will actually invest so much money to import coal, import iron ore, that it will become supremely expensive. So you have to do it in a place like Bihar, or you'll have to do it somewhere else. So you have to understand the location and the conditions and then decide. Let me give you a case in point here. Chandigarh as a city thought that it will actually become an IT hub. It never became an IT hub because it did not understand the local conditions, that there is no talent available. In fact, very simply put, when you talk about competitiveness and making an assessment of a location, there are 4 things that we have to see. Technology, talent, the availability of technology, the availability of talent, the territorial assets and tolerance, whether you are acceptable within a city or a state as well. So if you really talk about it, like the cities which have done exceedingly well in India, they are the melting pots of acceptance. You might hear some odd stories in Bombay, but at the end of the day, I think one of the finest cities in the country to live is Bombay. I am from Delhi, but if I ever have a chance, I would like to live in Bombay, in Colaba area. It's an amazing melting pot. And that's where you want to be. So that's how things would actually happen.
Dr. Mike, I'm a bit concerned about Suzuki. Because in Japan, when we quote the best example of a Japanese investment in India, Suzuki is quoted often. The Suzuki is given as an example of a successful business in India. So I'm really concerned about that report that they produced.
Well, one example is not going to create a killer company.
One model.
And it's just one model. And it's just an incidental thing. I think the enterprise has the possibility to improve. And let's understand the market. I think the Indian market has never been concerned about safety. So I think they were selling a product which sells in that part of the world. Like how many of us in India actually even think that airbags are important? In fact, a lot of us in India, even the rich people in the country would actually not buy a car with airbags or safety or supplementary restraint systems or whatever. We will not wear our seat belts. You'll hear of accidents on a Merc S-Class which has 23 airbags and a person dies in an accident. Why? Because the airbag opened and crushed his ribs and he was not wearing a seat belt. So the question is like, it's an attitudinal thing, it's about the market thing. The market is only now getting into the thing that, okay, we need to have some safety features. I think there is going to be a regulation sometime very soon, and there are indications to the effect that there are going to be basic safety requirements which are going to be made mandatory. And it's important for us to do it. I think India is a country which runs through regulation. India is, as a volunteering thing, no company in the country, whether international or whether Indian, they don't do anything. They will actually try to exploit the loopholes that exist. Whether it is Indian, whether it is Japanese, or it is American, or whatever they exploit it.
Yeah. But Suzuki is a kind of symbol of our success story in India, you see. And also, safety is something that Japanese companies are most concerned with. So if you say that Suzuki produces the most unsafe cars, then I think all the Japanese manufacturers will hesitate to go into India. Because, first of all, we don't believe that Suzuki produces such unsafe cars. And secondly, if Indians complain about this or make that kind of a claim, then you never know what's going to happen. That is the kind of mentality.
Okay, I'm going to use my position as the chair to put an end to the discussion of Suzuki's safety record. I mean, you may not say anything more. Is there another question not about Suzuki? just speak out
Okay,
loud.
sure. My name is Ija of Daniel from China. I'm a student at Waseda University. I have two questions. The first one is wondering, like, what's the venture capital's role in India's innovation? Like, is it being very active? Or, of course, not as a competitive as Silicon Valley we could think of, but is it very active? And how's the trend? The second one is, if you think about these days, people compare India and China a lot. If you think about Indians, overseas Indians, someone mentioned about overseas Indians, you see a lot of successful stories like those with the Citibank or like a Microsoft or Harvard Business School. But you see more like a Chinese entrepreneurs. I'm just curious, why there are more like big corporates, Indian corporates, than entrepreneurs like Chinese?
Indian corporate?
Corporate man, like people are very successful in corporate.
Using CEOs of companies, you hear of Indian CEOs of companies,
A lot of
but you don't hear of entrepreneurs.
Okay.
So two questions. First one's about the venture capital, second one.
Yeah, so coming to the venture capital thing, I think the scenario is heating up. If you were talking or asking me this question about 10 years back, then I would have said, oh, there is no venture capital industry, it's very weak and things. I think it's strengthening quite a lot right now. You are seeing a lot of what we call private capital or private equity coming in, venture capital firms coming in and doing some fantastic work. In fact, and you're also seeing some obscene valuations for enterprises in India. And I say something like one of the most recent valuations was for a company called Flipkart, which was valued at close to about $35 billion or whatever. I don't remember what was the, sorry, 35,000 crores, about $5 or $6 billion. So that was a crazy valuation for a firm that we have actually seen. So there is a whole huge paradigm into VC, and there are people who are investing across sectors. It's not only IT, they're investing in restaurants, they're investing in education, they're investing in very sexy sectors, as you might actually want to say, and they're getting into that. In terms of your second question, that was...
So many Indian CEOs.
Oh, I think it's just a question of, we've not really seen a lot of entrepreneurial activity within the country. In fact, if you see that traditionally how India has actually grown, we have to understand the historical context as well. Till about the 90s, I would rather say till about 1994, India did open in 1991. The seeds were sown in 1984, but the real change started happening in 1994. Till about 1994, it was a very strongly controlled licensing regime. So what would happen is that the enterprises or families or business families would actually pick up a license for various set of industries. And you see a lot of conglomerates in action in India. Tata operates close to about 89 different companies. You have Mahindras, which operate about 110 different enterprises. And they're into across the products. So Tatas are operating from salt to cars. Now they're into what they call defense. They're also into airline services and so on and so forth. So that is the traditional way that Indian enterprises actually grew up. And these guys control too much. In fact, you might see it as a danger, you might see it as an opportunity. 3% to 4% of India's GDP comes from one single enterprise. Very dangerous as a proposition from a sovereign point of view. Because when Reliance actually contributes 3% to 4% of India's GDP, that's dangerous. In fact, a very interesting statistic would be that the top 10 families in the country control wealth which is equal to the bottom 350 million people. So those are statistics that you could see, but the question is, the wealth they control, the entrepreneurial mindset, the ecosystem for people to actually go out. Today, I think if you fail as an entrepreneur in India, there is no way that you can actually come back. The US system actually celebrates failure. The Indian system does not celebrate failure. I think in US, I have seen it myself. If you fail, I think people would be there to actually help you again and say, oh, I think you've actually got experience and a positive experience of failing, and let's actually put money behind him. Because he knows that he's not going to do the same set of mistakes, but it might not actually happen in India. Things are changing now, not that it's not going to happen, but it's going to take about 10, 15 years or maybe 20 years. And you are moving into that direction.
Sorry, my question was more like overseas Indians are so successful with big international.
That's what it is, because if you really look at it, overseas Indians are working in the enterprises outside and they are successful. And then you've not really seen the emergence of large number of Indian enterprises at the global level. Or at least you're not studying about the Indian enterprises. There are CEOs who are operating Indian enterprises. It's not that it was running without them. They're not popular. They're not in the Financial Times. Their PR activity is weak. So they need to invest more in PR and get themselves into the press. That is what I would say. That if you're not aware, but there are very smart CEOs. Like overseas Indians are getting celebrated, They actually sell the whole idea of being Indian and I think that's very exotic. But the Indian CEOs, we're not really talking about them. There are tons of them, actually.
Well, we've reached the end of our time and the end of this panel, so please join me in thanking our panelists for their discussion and comments, and please thank also Minister Singh for being with us again today.
Thank you very much for coming to attend the USJI and NBR joint sessions, joint seminars on innovation in the India-Japan economic relationship. At the time when we are approached by NBR to have these seminars, we are a little bit worried that because this session will be conducted in English, and there will be no simultaneous translation interpretations. And also, topic is very much focused on the relation, or especially relation between India and Japan, and especially on IP-related issues. But today, I really enjoyed the very lively discussions of many aspects of India, Japan, and the United States. And I would like to thank all the panelists and also the audience as well. And at the end, I would like to ask your permission, because we have videotaped these sessions, and I would like to receive your permission to make this video public through the internet. Is it okay? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well, I just have to check with the minister if he's angry.
That's okay. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Anyway, thank you very much for attending to this very stimulating and innovative and informative session. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.